we tend to, and this is another thing we have to get out of our head, we think of Judaism. We say, okay, well, there was Judaism, and then Christianity came out of Judaism. And when we think about Judaism, we think about, okay, well, there's a synagogue down the street from me. If it's not a liberal synagogue, if it's not a Reformed synagogue, if it's more of an Orthodox synagogue, we say, okay, well, that's Judaism. That's what Judaism was like. And of course, that kind of Judaism didn't exist. That kind of Judaism came into being basically in the 5th century, the 4th and 5th centuries, AD. We've got, when scholars talk about that Old Testament period, there's the period of ancient Israel and their religion that was centered around the tabernacle and then around Solomon's temple. And then the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed, and the southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile in Babylon. Judah came back and became Judea, and they rebuilt the temple. And so then the period from when they rebuilt the temple, around 500 BC, until 70 AD, when that temple got destroyed by the Romans, is called the Second Temple period. And so the religion in between there is called Second Temple Judaism. And then later on, you have Rabbinic Judaism. That's the Judaism we have today, where Rabbinic Judaism is formed. But even when we talk about Second Temple Judaism from 500 BC to the end of the 1st century AD, into the 2nd century AD, that's not one united religion where everybody believes the same thing and teaches the same thing and everybody's on the same page. This is more like, say, modern American evangelicalism, where they all consider themselves Christians, right? And they're in these different groups, but these groups have very different beliefs sometimes. And some of the groups think some of the other groups aren't really Jewish. Some of the groups think some of the other groups have gone too far. And they see other groups that disagree with them, but they say, okay, well, we disagree, but they're close enough to us that we're all Jewish. We just have these different groups. We're confronted with some of these groups in the pages of the scriptures. For example, we see the Pharisees as probably the most famous, the Sadducees, who had control of the temple, the scribes, some of whom were Pharisees and some of whom were part of different groups. There are also a group called the Essenes, and the Dead Sea Scrolls were made by that group. They were more, the Essenes were sort of a separatist group, or groups. There were actually many groups of Essenes who went out into into deserts and wildernesses and sort of formed their own alternative communities. In a lot of ways, they're the forerunners of Christian monasticism. These are just, and we can throw in the Zealots, who were all about political overthrow of the Roman government. 2 of Christ's disciples, 2 of the 12 were Zealots. One of them was Judas, and that didn't turn out so well. But St. Simon the Zealot ended up becoming a saint. So those are just groups in Palestine, right? That's just in Palestinian Judaism. In the 1st century, where we see multiple groups who all disagree with each other. The Essenes thought that everybody else was cut off. They thought they were the only faithful remnant of Judaism. The Pharisees thought the Sadducees were heretics, right? And the Sadducees thought the Pharisees were fundamentalists, right? And they couldn't agree. Now, if you expand beyond that and you start talking about Ethiopian Judaism at that time, or Egyptian Judaism at that time, or Judaism as far in Western Europe as Tarshish in Spain, there was a Jewish community. And that there were multiple groups in all of these places too. There's just this vast array of different beliefs and different texts that people are reading and think are authoritative. And it's not this one united picture. And so scholars will say, minimally, Jacob Neusner is a rabbinical Jewish scholar who is famous for saying this, that we should talk about Judaisms, plural, when we talk about that period, that they're not even just different forms of Judaism, but Judaisms. They're that different. Some scholars now, rabbinic scholars, are arguing that we shouldn't even talk about Judaism during that period because it's just a whole different thing. And it's misleading to even call it Judaism. But I don't think we need to go that far. But the point being that there was this disagreement. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and when in 135 AD, after the last Jewish revolt, Jerusalem, the entire city, was destroyed by the Romans, and a new city was built over it. This, of course, sent shockwaves through what remained of Judaism, because the one or two things that had united all of those Jewish groups was that the center of their religion and their religious life, and therefore their whole lives, the whole center of their identity religiously, had surrounded that temple in Jerusalem and the sacrifices that were made there. Even the groups that didn't accept that temple, like the Essenes who went out in the desert, even they were defined by the fact that they were rejecting the temple, right? That's what united them together, is that they thought the temple was corrupt, right? They were sort of dissidents against that. So even the people who didn't accept that temple were defined by that temple in terms of their community identity. So they had to sort of reorganize or die out. Right? They no longer had a priesthood. They no longer had sacrifices. They no longer had a temple. And there was no prospect of them getting any of those things back again. Pharisees in particular had always been very devoted to the written text. So that's why they're called the teachers of the law, the teachers of the Torah in the New Testament. That had always been their primary focus. They had acknowledged the temple, but their focus had been on the text of the Torah and the commandments and the keeping of the commandments and the keeping of the way of life described in those commandments. And so this became one of the reasons why they were better able to survive than some of the others. The Sadducees, of course, their whole basis was that they controlled the temple. So without the temple, they ceased to exist. And so out of all of those groups that we just mentioned, only two really survived. One of those were the Pharisees, who ended up becoming Rabbinic Judaism, evolved into what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. And the other one was a somewhat newer group within that panoply of Jewish groups, and that was Christianity. So those were the two that sort of survived the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the temple.